Welcome, everyone. We're very excited to have you on the line today. I just want to do one quick check with John and Sherif. Hey, guys, are you still there?
Yep, good morning, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Perfect. Well, just to make a few introductions, I'm broadcasting to you live from San Francisco, California, and today's presenters are live in Sydney, Australia. We're really happy that you're all able to join us today for the webinar. If you were one of the unlucky ones to be blocked from our previous webinar, Lessons Learned from Atlassian Product Manager, that was 3 weeks ago, this webinar is a chance to make up for lost time. My name is Ryan Anderson. I'm the Product Marketing Manager for Confluence, our team collaboration platform. And I'm joined today by one of Confluence's product managers, Sherif Mansour.
Good morning, everyone.
And fellow Confluence product manager, John Masson.
Hi, all.
Before we start the webinar, I just wanted to encourage everyone to ask questions using the GoToWebinar control panel. You'll see on the slide up there where exactly to type in your questions. We'll try to answer your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll save some of the most popular ones for the end when we hold an additional Q&A session for everyone who's in attendance today. I also wanted to let everyone know that this webinar will be recorded, and we'll email you with a link to the recording as soon as it's available. If you want to tweet about the webinar, please use the official hashtag for the webinar. That's hashtag #DoAgileRight. This will just help us get an idea of kind of what feedback people have, what they learned, and get an idea of how useful the webinar was for you guys. As you may or may not know, this is a 3-part webinar series, and we have a 4th part today that you're all lucky enough to be in attendance for. But I just wanted to run through the webinar series. And in case if you weren't one of the blocked attendees and you found out about this webinar, 3 weeks ago we presented the first of our 3-part webinar series about how Atlassian does Agile. Today's presenters discussed how we do product management at Atlassian and focused on Agile product requirements and the art of prototyping. This webinar has been recorded and it's available on the Atlassian blog. Last week, we were joined by Confluence Development Manager Anatoly Kozhestikov and Confluence developer Edith Tom, and they shared the Confluence development team's top 5 Agile practices and how best to transition your team from Waterfall to Agile. That is also recorded and is also available on the Atlassian blog. The final webinar in our series is coming next week, and it actually focuses on my team, the Atlassian marketing team, and how we employ the Agile methodology. My colleagues Matt Hodges and John Wettenhall will share how our team has adopted Agile and how we plan and execute on our quarterly goals. Please help us spread the word. Please help us spread the word to your teams. If you have a marketing team that's interested in Agile, please send them our way. We have a really insightful webinar next week, and if you're interested in our previous webinar or the one about software development, go to the Atlassian blog and check those recordings out. So I also wanted to clarify that despite the title of our webinar series, there is no right way to do Agile. Agile is not a one-size-fits-all methodology. There are guiding principles, but every team must choose how they implement them. And secondly, Agile is not just for software development teams. Every team can be Agile. Throughout the course of our webinar series, the webinar today and the next one, we've tried to show how product management and marketing teams can practice many of the Agile methodologies to constantly improve their process. Before we jump into the Q&A, I just wanted to do a quick recap of who the Confluence team is and how we break it down. The Confluence team is based primarily in Sydney. We're made up of more than 100 people across engineering, product management, marketing, support, QA, design, and 80 of them are in engineering and design, and we have 4 product managers that work closely with the team. So our development team is divided up into 4 focus groups, and each focus group has a leading product manager and development manager. Sherif is in charge of the software development focus group, and John Masson is in charge of the Confluence platform. So the division allows our developers and product managers to focus on specific user stories, and it requires that everyone works together to ship new cohesive releases together. So before we begin, I just wanted to poll the audience and just get an idea of kind of what are some of your biggest pain points when you're developing software. So I'm going to launch the poll now. You should be able to see the poll on your screen, and you can submit your responses by clicking the dots and clicking submit. I'll just give a couple of seconds here while people put in their answers. All right, I'm going to close the poll. I'll share the results with you guys. So as you can see, there's actually the overwhelming majority of you want to make sure that the most difficult thing you find is ensuring that your team has effective processes and best practices, and that's great news, and we're glad you're here because that's mostly what we're going to cover today. So now I'll jump back to my slides, and we'll get started with the Q&A portion of our webinar. So Sherif and John, let's get started. Our first question from the webinar last week that we thought was really interesting was, how do you best model your team structure inside Jira and Jira Agile?
Thanks, Ryan. So yeah, like the slide that you see says, it really comes down to your team and how your team's set up and how you work. But a couple of examples that we've used here, or I've seen customers using. The one which is pretty much the Confluence model, we have one Jira project and then many teams using it, and each team has an Agile board. So basically, this is sort of what we use, and it's good because we get to share the workflow. So we're all one team. Confluence is one product where we're split up into sub-teams doing different things, but we want to have the same workflow. We want to be able to move issues between teams, and we want something that we can change the structure of how teams are set up. We can form little teams to work on small features, disband them. We can do all of that without having to go in and re-engineer our Jira project. So that works really well for us. Probably the downside is if you have individual teams that need totally separate workflows, or you want to have a lot of different custom fields for different teams, this wouldn't work for you. Just a sort of a tip that we do. We use components for our teams, and we break everything up based on that, but we see a lot of people that set up a custom field in Jira for the team name, so they can use the components for something else and just have a specific team field and track things that way. So an alternate method that we see around is having a single project for a single team, and then one Agile board sitting on top of that. So each team has full control of their schemes then. They don't impact anybody else. They can have things completely customized. There's a bit more maintenance and a bit more overhead. The other risk with it too, if you're in a team like Confluence, which has sub-teams, there can be a problem with sort of visibility and who's doing what, or if you move teams, you don't understand how this team does it, because not everything's the same. So that's the downside to all that control.
Great, thanks, John. I just also wanted to take a moment just to remind everyone that if you have questions yourself, I know we're only on our first one, please type them through the control panel. It's looking a little lonely right now, but if the questions we're answering suffice, then we're happy with that too. So moving on, how do you deal, I think this one's directed towards you, Sherif, how do you deal with the seemingly infinitely growing backlog of features?
Yeah, I remember from our last webinar, we actually had quite a few questions related to this topic. How do I prune my backlog? How do I deal with a large list? At what point do you close things off? This is a huge challenge. We hear a lot from our customers running Agile teams. As they're working day to day, they go, oh, that would be nice, let's put it in the backlog. And incrementally over a period of weeks and months, they have a look at that backlog and they're like, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to do with this huge list? I know I certainly have gone through that experience as well, and John's smiling and laughing at me because I think he probably saw his backlog this morning as well. So I don't think there's one quick, straight answer to this, but what we have done is we've thought about all the different techniques and practices that teams do to keep their backlog pruned, I guess, up to date, and make sure that they've only got the most important things in their backlog. So the things that we we practice here internally, and we've actually observed quite a few customers practice as well, is the first thing they do is they try to establish an ongoing triage process. So this can be done through a wide variety of techniques in Jira. For example, they may have someone as a project observer, and that means they get notified on every new ticket that comes in. Or for noisy projects, that may be too loud, and so what they might do is they might set up a filter for issues in a particular state, like an untriaged state. And what they'll do is they'll have is one person who's the primarily person responsible for triaging, and that can be the feature lead, the team lead, and for large teams, they often rotate that role internally. And their job is to constantly prune and make sure everything that's coming into the backlog is validated. Everyone agrees that it's an important thing, and it'll happen sometime soon. Another technique we've seen is that teams take a fresh perspective or have a check-in point at the end of each release. I know we certainly do this inside the Confluence team at Atlassian. And what we do is at the end of each release, we have a meeting scheduled that's literally a backlog check-in meeting. And we pretty much say, what's left in the backlog? Do we feel it's important enough to address immediately? Or is there some items in the backlog that we would like to take we use the phrase, a wait and see approach? I.e., do we think we have enough validation and feedback to tackle this now? If we don't, let's put that in the wait and see bucket. And so what we typically do there is we move issues and cut issues that are in the wait and see bucket, and we create essentially a someday list, like or a workflow state that's on the back burner. Some teams create new projects, that's their someday projects. Some people just modify the workflow state to have a long-term kind of state. And what they do is they revisit that state at the end of the following release, and if they've had no feedback, they close them off. So they don't want to close them off immediately because the ticket itself holds some value. There's some helpful information in the ticket, so they'll leave it open. But as they get feedback throughout their release process, they'll comment on the ticket and they'll bump its priority, and the important things will bubble up again. So there's a few techniques and processes that we do ourselves, and we've seen other Agile teams do to help deal with the crazy backlog problem that a lot of teams are challenged with today. I will leave with it. I think really it comes down to a big discipline problem, and it really is about setting up those processes and procedures to be able to prune those things regularly. And I've often heard the phrase courage as well. A few customers have referred to is there seems to be this fear sometimes from product managers or from feature leads, where they're hesitant to close issues off because someone reported it and they're not sure. But it really is part of that is actually taking courage and saying no to things. And saying no to those things means that you can close them off, or it actually means, hey, we may revisit this in a year's time, so we'll kind of temporarily close this off now. I'm not sure about you, John, but have you had this challenge in your team? What's probably any of those techniques have been really effective for you?
Yeah, I think this is one of those things that it's like exercise. You can't go out and do 2 days of non-stop exercise and then you're fit. This is something you need to do all the time, and a lot of those things you've mentioned are really useful, particularly that ongoing triage process. With a couple of the teams I look after, we have a weekly, we sit down for an hour, and we're not going to get through the whole backlog in that hour, but it's just chipping away at it, making sure that we're closing or bumping priority or doing that sort of stuff. The other thing is having a primary owner. I think really somebody whose job it is to worry about this, because if it's a collective thing, it's easy to slip under the radar and disappear. So you don't have to have one person who does it all, but one person who's driving it. Absolutely. So those are some of the techniques there. If you've actually got techniques or tips that you do, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to post them as a question, or if you have any questions about some of the suggestions we've made, feel free to post them as well. Back to you, Ryan, for the next question.
Great, thanks guys. And I see a few questions coming through. We'll jump back to those after we've answered some of the ones we've already decided on. So next up, this is a role-based question. On the Confluence team, who decides on priorities for new features?
Yeah, this is a good question, and there was also another couple of related questions in the last webinar, which is whose job function is it to decide on priorities, etc. At Atlassian, and it's certainly the case for most customers that we speak to, Product managers and all product owners essentially own the high-level roadmap, and that involves deciding on the high-level priorities. And what I mean by high-level is kind of the epic-based priorities. You know, what next big problem are we solving next? And so that's the kind of stuff they do. How do they decide on the priorities? I should say. Or specifically to this question, how do we do it in the Confluence team? Well, there's a lot of inputs. Inputs can vary from a whole bunch of customer interviews that we do on a regular basis. We visit customers on site, and quite frequently we do video conferencing with them and we share screens. We've also got the strategic direction of the product and the product roadmap. Where is the market heading? Where do we see ourselves fitting in that market? And how does this product fit with other company initiatives, other products that we have? What problems are we trying to solve, and for who are we trying to solve it? Also, part of the roadmap may involve some, we use the phrase internally, big bets, or I guess more courageous, bold moves. And, you know, I'm sure a lot of you have heard the expression that building something incrementally or doing minor incremental improvements is helpful for building a good product, but won't necessarily be game-changing in any way. And so we're always constantly thinking about what are the big market trends and the big things that customers are requesting for, and should we make a big leap into one of those problem areas. So there's a lot of different inputs. Those are just some there. Many of you here are Atlassian customers, so you know we also have a public issue tracker where we gauge a lot of feedback from you guys. We observe trends there as well, and we prioritize those in our backlog. So at a high level, the product manager does this task. But what we've found at Atlassian, and again, a lot of customers tell us the same thing, is scaling product management is a huge challenge. It's much easier to hire a software engineer or a QA person because you can actually give them a very easy coding test. You know, you can measure their performance much easier than product managers. And so generally, it's quite difficult to hire product managers, especially in Australia. That's a big challenge for us. So if you are interested in moving out here, I should give ourselves a plug. You should let us know. But so what we've done to solve this problem is we've introduced the concept of feature leads at Atlassian. And a feature lead is someone who's still the primary software engineer or the primary person responsible for the feature. But what they do is they take on the day-to-day prioritization of the actual backlog. So once the epic's been defined and they have a high-level focus area, the epic essentially ultimately turns into dozens, sometimes even hundreds of Jira tasks. We work closely with the feature leads to help PM scale, and we meet with them on a weekly basis or a fortnightly basis, and they kind of propose what the next set of backlogs are. And we will discuss it, challenge it, work together, bounce ideas off each other, but they ultimately own the day-to-day backlog. And we've found this to be probably the most effective process we've put in place to help product management scale, but also to help have a little bit of a product manager in everyone. The feature lead role, we rotate. So some people try it, some people like it, some engineers don't. We've actually had quite a few engineers transition to product management because they enjoy it a lot. I don't know why, but you know, they've obviously found some interest there. But that's something else that we do there as well. So the communication is very important there between the feature leads and the PMs, and we have these check-ins. So I hope that kind of gives you a bit of insight for all the inputs that we get, how we try and establish a process for scaling all the inputs and prioritizing on a day-to-day basis, and the importance of communication with whoever's doing the day-to-day work when building your roadmap. Yeah, so Ryan, what have we got next?
Awesome. Thanks, Sherif. So this is in relation to QA. How do you handle QA and test cases when you have minimal requirements documented?
Yeah, so for a bit of context, in the original webinar, Sherif said something pretty controversial, which was we basically try to avoid writing documentation upfront for features. So this question came up where somebody said, well, you know, if you guys don't completely document the feature to start with, how does QA know how it's supposed to work and how to test it? So the basic answer is we don't just not write documentation and do nothing. We replace that with other things. So user journeys, sketching, interviews, prototyping, all of these things that we do instead of like a full-on detailed spec. we get Q&A involved in. So they join along in that process. So they're getting the understanding that we're developing over time and the developers are developing as well. So that basically they're just on the same page. The other thing that's probably important in that context too is that QA is a little bit different at Atlassian to a lot of other places, where it's not QA's job to take the finished product and test it. Their role is sort of being in the process and calling out, identifying the risks or potential bug patterns that they see in this feature. So if we're doing this feature X, they will say, these are the things that are problematic in doing this. This is what you should be looking out for, and basically acting as advisors to the developers on areas that they should really be focused on when they're doing their testing, which is how it works here. Back to you, Ryan.
Cool. Thanks, John. So this is a two-part question. At what point during the planning process do you decide when extensive documentation of requirements is necessary? And why and when do you use Jira over Confluence for defining product requirements?
Yeah, this really flows on from the last question, and if you haven't had a chance to view the last webinar, that's where we discussed heavily the different techniques we do when we don't write requirements documents. But we also talked about quite often, especially for large epics, we do end up writing a requirements document. It's just not our first instinct, and it's not what we try to do initially. And so how do we know when to do this? Is there a process? Is there a set of scenarios that we reach where we actually say, yep, for this one we'll write a requirements document, and for this one we don't? I actually went back to the team and discussed this with my feature leads and said, well, have you observed any trends in how we're doing this? Could you point to any specific things? And the truth is, it's actually quite organic. So what we often try to do is we start small. We try to break down verbally through discussions the feature or the story that we're trying to make and put it straight into the backlog in Jira. Now, sometimes what ends up happening is we've got it wrong. We've missed some things. We've forgotten about a few things. And as an engineer may pick up the ticket or someone's triaging the ticket, they look at it and they go, but have we thought about X, Y, Z? Or what about this scenario? Or et cetera, et cetera. And at that point, we kind of try to resolve it then on the ticket, but sometimes you realize, actually, there's a lot more thinking we have to do. So in one scenario, we've tried to raise it straight into a story in our backlog, and then realized, actually, there's a lot more considerations we need to handle. Some things like some user scenarios we didn't consider, maybe some technical or user experience constraints that we had not thought about. Or quite often, especially if you're working with software that's been around for a while, there's a lot of orthogonal or adjacent features that are impacted that need changes in order for you to achieve your task. And so at that point, sometimes we take a step back and we say, okay, well, let's go back and write a requirements document for this, and we'll use the requirements blueprint in Confluence to help us to do this, as I mentioned in the last webinar. But on the flip side, sometimes we have a big initiative that we want to tackle, and we won't go straight and create a Jira ticket for a very large feature. It doesn't make any sense. And so in that case scenario, we might sometimes start with a page, which is the requirements, or a user journey, or all those other techniques we talked about in the last webinar. Really, there is no one-size-fits-all, we've come to realize. You do need to be flexible in that you need to be able to say, stop, let's go back and look at that, which can be challenging for Agile teams because they've already put a story in their backlog, and now we're saying, hey, let's take a step back and almost pull this story back out. But that's certainly not a fail at all. In fact, you've probably saved yourself a lot of time and effort for the times when the story was just sufficient and you just did enough and you didn't have to over-document and you didn't have to spend all this time writing comprehensive documentation when a story in someone's backlog was good enough. So I hope that kind of summarizes the process there. There is no, I guess, straight answer other than it's quite organic. We try to get it straight into the ticket as often as possible. Sometimes we don't. And when we don't, we are either writing a requirements document or we're looking at user journeys, prototyping, any other scenarios that help us define the problem or the scenario in which we're trying to solve the problem. So back to you, Ryan. I think you've got a really exciting question that we got asked last webinar that I really wanted to answer, but you told me to hold off on that question.
I do. Yeah, it was probably the most important question we were asked. So it's what type of beer do you guys drink? And I'll let you guys just say a few words, but we'll keep moving through this slide.
John, do you want to go first?
Yes, the Three Boys wheat beer. So I've had 2 of these in my life in New Zealand, and you have to know somebody who knows the guys that make this beer. I couldn't get any more, and so it's kind of my white whale that I'm always looking for.
So you've only had this once?
Well, I had 2 beers.
Twice?
Yeah, on one occasion.
Right. So you couldn't get some in Australia or?
No, I emailed them. I was like, "Can you guys send it?" I didn't hear back.
Oh.
They're built on an enigma.
I find this quite frustrating that you've flashed this awesome beer in front of us and you're saying we can't even taste it.
Yes, but if you can get it, then please send some to us.
Oh, John. My beer, on the other hand, is an Australian brewed beer, which you can get overseas, slightly expensive. It's called Four Pines. It's actually brewed in Manly in Australia. If you haven't been here, it's a beautiful beach suburb and a great place to be. It's a small brewery that does. It's called Four Pines. They try and look very organic and say it's hand brewed naturally, et cetera, but forget about all that stuff. All I can tell you is that it tastes really good. So Four Pines is my favorite beer for whoever asked that question in the last webinar. Ryan, do you have a favorite beer?
Yeah, my beer is a San Francisco-based brewery. It's called Russian River Brewing Company. It's about an hour north of San Francisco. And they make a double India Pale Ale that even people that don't like hoppy beers love, and people that do love hoppy beers love. So it's a mystery, but it's delicious. Cool. Well, thanks, guys. Let's keep moving through our questions. Another 2-part question for you is, how do you balance between short-term goals with a longer-term product lifecycle architecture? And what if you find out these short-term solutions become unsupportable in the long run?
Cool. So the first thing I'd just start with is sometimes it's okay if you build something that doesn't scale. We've built things before that we're not sure how this is going to go, and we put it out there and it's super successful, and we need to scale it. If we want to improve it, we need to rebuild it, and that's okay. I think the alternative is you spend a whole heap of engineering time up front and build something that nobody uses, and you've wasted that time. So that's the first point. A quick example of that, tasks in Confluence pages. So we could see a whole bunch of things you need around tasks, but the very first thing we wanted to do was just start super simple, lightweight. We let you put a task on a page, and you could check it and uncheck it, and people would be notified and be assigned to people. So there's a whole bunch of stuff behind that. We knew you want dates, we want reporting, all of that stuff, but we didn't build that first because we wanted to see first, will people use this? So we put it out there. It was super successful. All of those things came up that people asked for them. And now we've had to do a bit of re-engineering on that feature, but that's okay. It's better to do that now and add those features in now that we know that that's something successful. And I think that's always less, well, not always, but generally less expensive than spending a whole bunch of time building something that's never used and you end up having to throw away. In terms of trying to make the right call as to what to build, invest in from an architecture point of view, we have a couple of product architects on the Confluence team, and we try to get them across the roadmap and what we're doing so they can call out things that are perhaps things that are worth investing in, things that we should do right, things that have extra benefits for extra features down the road if we do something at a certain time now. And also that kind of extends into the rest of the technical team as well. So for us as product managers, having a clear roadmap of what we want to do, the whole technical team can look at that and call out patterns in what we're doing and basically say to us, like, if we want to do all of these things, we should stop and think about doing this thing. So an example of something we're kind of working on at the moment, we had a whole bunch of things we wanted to do around notifications. And our architect and technical lead came to us and said, well, all of this stuff, if you really want to achieve this and do it well and do it in a way that's going to work into the future, we need to think about re-architecting at a lower level how notifications work in Confluence. So that's something we're working on at the moment, and sets us up for a whole bunch of other things that we'll be able to do soon and later out in the future. So that's a good example of where they could see the roadmap, they saw what we wanted to do and said, no, first we need to undertake this kind of big technical chunk of work. I guess the other thing is that as sort of a tip is you don't have to see every problem and think about the super long term. Sometimes it's enough to just think about the immediate problem, solve that, and see how that goes, and then bring it in. So it's another one of those things that it depends on what you're doing, it depends on circumstances, but yeah, that's kind of the way we deal with it.
Cool. Thanks,
back to you, Ryan.
So another two-part question for you guys. It was, how do you justify the time to build a prototype when you have limited time for development? And how do you sell the need for the time to prototype to the rest of the business?
And this question comes from the Agile webinar that we had with our Confluence engineering team. So we had our team lead and the Confluence team and one of our engineers talk about this, and they spent a bit of time talking about the importance of prototyping. And John actually also spent a bit of time discussing this in the product management webinar as well. So if you haven't, if you want to learn more about that, I encourage you to check out those videos. How do we justify the time? How do we sell the need to the business? We really think it's all about articulating your risks for any piece of work. You get a piece of work, and there's really a set of risks, and those risks can form from some questions that you might have about the feature, some scenarios that you're a bit worried about, some edge cases or use cases that you're not sure of, which you're struggling to mitigate from just a discussion or designs or some customer validation, but you think there's more that we need to do. So if you can articulate those risks for any given piece of work and discuss how they can be mitigated with a prototype, we found that to be probably the most effective I guess, process to decide when we need to do a prototype or not. Now, part of that, I guess, risk assessment is kind of calculating the opportunity cost of building the wrong thing. If you spend a lot of time building the wrong thing, what better things could you have done with that time? And so if you look at it from that angle, we've also found that to be a very helpful way to pitch it to your customers, or sometimes to your internal or external customers, to encourage them to I guess, validate or give you the stamp of approval to go ahead and to build a prototype. It's a good question to ask them that we've used internally is, what do you value more? Do you value delivering something on time, or do you value building the right thing? Building the right thing versus delivering something on time. And so that's a good discussion that you can have with your stakeholders to help you justify your prototype, or to sell the idea of doing a prototype to your business customers.
Cool. Thanks, Sherif. So moving on to our last question. This is something that actually we covered a lot in the software engineering webinar, but given some of the content that John and Sherif presented, we felt the need to address remote teams. So I'll read the question off, and then I wanted to do a quick poll. It's, how are remote teams included when there's so much written or drawn down on walls? And I'm just going to bring up a poll now. You should see the poll coming up on your screens. And you can just select whichever one and then click submit, and I'll wait for the majority of the audience to submit their answers. Looks like we have a good majority now. I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So as you can see on your screen, it's about a fifth of you say you are a distributed team, 36% say no, and most of you say partially, which is good because at Atlassian and on the Confluence team, we are also a partially distributed software development team. And I'll let Sherif and John talk to that a little bit.
It's great to hear so many of you are in, I guess, similar scenarios to us as well. We're also partially, we have some teams working remote and some teams working local. And in the last webinar, I talked about how we use different techniques for discovering or identifying problems. And some of those techniques were physical. We talked about paper prototyping. We talked about sketching on walls, whiteboarding. We create war rooms sometimes or map out user journeys across a wall where we sit. And so a question that came in from the last webinar is, if you guys do that a lot, how then do you work with distributed teams? What are some techniques or challenges that you face there? And it certainly is a challenge, and it actually is important for you to be aware of this before you kind of pick up the feature or the piece of work that you want to tackle. There are a few things that we do. I guess the first thing we spend a lot of time doing is video conferencing together. We will video conference each other, either one-on-one or quite often we'll have daily stand-ups around the TV, as you can see in the photo there, where we will discuss things with the team. Now, stand-ups, how do they relate to the requirements that you're currently working on? Well, they're often discussed every single day. And so having a stand-up around there is very, very helpful. Sometimes we'll get the camera there that you can kind of see under the TV, and we'll point it towards the whiteboard or a board or a wall that we already have, mapped out some journeys, and zoom in literally. And that helps a lot. That's great for discussion and great in providing context for remote teams as well. The other thing we do is we spend a lot of time in HipChat. HipChat has really become an immersive tool that a lot of Atlassians leave open all the time. And we work a lot with customers, with our, I guess, internal partners and engineers in HipChat a lot. And we're always doing things like pasting images, putting screenshots in there, taking photos with our phone and embedding them in HipChat. And not only in HipChat, quite often as well, it goes onto a Confluence page. So sometimes we'll whiteboard something and then take photos of that, and then that'll go on a Confluence page. Or on the Confluence page, we'll write down the status of some particular requirements that we're working on. From there, we'll get a lot of collaboration that happens asynchronously. So these are the scenarios where we don't have time to video conference, or it's a different time zone, so you'll see there a lot of comments happen. A lot of people ask questions, and this is a great way to collaborate asynchronously, and we talked about it in the last webinar. We've been amazed the amount of times where someone else that's not even involved in the project will jump into the conversation and contribute a lesson learned from a similar task or scenario that they worked with as well. So a mix of using a lot of video, especially spending a lot of time in HipChat, and then working asynchronously in tools like Confluence really helps us to keep the team up to date, putting images of our whiteboards and so on. I will also plug, we had a customer come into our Atlassian Summit. That's our yearly conference that we hold. She gave a fascinating and quite entertaining talk called I Work in Pajamas. So if you Google I Work in Pajamas Atlassian Summit, you'll see a YouTube video of that talk, and quite a lot of similar techniques and processes. And she also discusses the tools that her team does about that stuff. I think, John, you also had some thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, so the one other thing I'd add is, particularly as a lot of people here said that they're in a partially mixed team. Now, I take that to mean that you've kind of got something you consider head office and then a smaller satellite team somewhere. I think particularly in that scenario, it's important in the main office, if you like, to have a champion for the external team. So someone who, when you're having that conversation that happens in the hallway, someone's like, hey, we've got to write this down, it's got to get to that team. To remember that things get published, that we do things over video conference, just have that champion on the other end to make sure that the other team stays involved.
Cool, thanks, guys.
Cool, that's it, Ryan.
Yeah, that's our last question. So the presentation, well, before we move on to QA, the presentation is over. Now what? We actually have a microsite on our website. If you go to atlassian.com/agile, there's a lot of really good content on there about best practices, how we do it at Atlassian, and some real funny videos. We have a character named Chet Wrong, and he'll tell you all about the wrong way to do Agile. Just a few videos to share with your team that you guys might find funny. But there's a lot of really good content on there about Agile best practices and also how to use our tools in a way that allows you to have a best practice. So just go ahead over there if you're interested in learning more outside of these webinars. For now, I'd like to just run another quick poll or two before we move on to your questions. This is the first time we've done a Q&A style webinar. We're kind of interested to see what you guys think. So I'm going to launch the poll now. And we'd love to know if it was useful or not useful. One of the selections there is would you prefer a presentation. So if the first type of webinar we did with Bill and Sherif was more interest of you and you felt like the content was more interesting, let us know, and we'd love to know because we really want to provide content to you guys and information to you guys, and we want to know what the best medium to do that is. Great, most of you guys have voted through, and we're excited to hear that you guys would register for another Q&A style webinar. I won't share the results. I'm going to move on to our final question. Should be coming up on your screen now. And it's basically, we are just dabbling in kind of these Agile best practice webinars, and we have a lot of different teams at Atlassian, and we've seen a great response rate from you guys and seem very interested in the topic. There's a number of different topics that we can present on, and we're just trying to get an idea of where we should go next. So you'll see there's roadmap planning and user experience and design, some tutorials on how to use Jira, Jira Agile, and Confluence together, best practices on customer interviews, and working with QA. And we'd just love to get an idea of what our next webinar should be about. Great, most of you have voted. I'll share the results on this one. And we'll start going into QA. It looks like most of you are interested in roadmap planning, followed up by some tutorials on how best to use our products. So we're glad to see these results, and it gives us some input on where to go next. So John and Sherif, if you open up the questions tab in your panel, hopefully you'll see a few questions typed through. Looks like Mark, Amy, and Paul have contributed a couple. Just go ahead and read off the question and answer the ones you think are best answering.
Sure. So, Paul, you had a question on how we document features for customers and how the documentation team gets involved. So this is actually fairly similar to how I talked about QA. We have two technical writers on the team now, but one actually just started. So previously we've just had one, Rachel, so she's actually very, very good at explaining things, as you'd imagine, for a tech writer. And we often get her involved in the feature development anywhere where you see text on the screen. She's often involved in that, so she's aware of quite a lot of what we're doing. We have each of the product managers have a weekly sync up with her just to sort of keep her in the loop with what's happening. But she's also very active in watching tickets, watching the pages where things are being developed and just keeping across things that way. So she's kind of always in tune with what we're doing. It's a very, very fluid role for her, but it's pretty much just integrating with how everybody else works like that and just keeping up with the development and seeing what's landing where and all of that sort of stuff.
Another question that's come in from Amy, this is a good question. She said, you talked about how a product manager kind of manages the overall epics and the team manages the backlog. So she said, where does the product manager come in here? Do they manage the project in terms of scope? How exactly does it work? And so we actually never used to have this split between what I referred to earlier as a feature lead or a technical lead that would manage the day-to-day backlog many years ago at Atlassian. So we were much smaller. About 4 years ago, I was the only product manager on the team, and I would do the roadmap and the actual backlog prioritization. So what high-level things we're working on and what small-level things we're working on. Fast forward several years later, we've got a ratio of about 10 engineers to one product manager, probably a bit higher. And so this becomes a much bigger challenge here. And so what does the product manager do? Well, they kind of set the high-level epic priority and work on the definition for those. So, we're going to tackle this particular problem, and they'll work with a feature lead and a designer to come up with a solution and an engineer. But then that problem's individual priority breakdown that's done more of a collaboration between the product manager or the product owner and the feature lead, the primary engineers responsible for that feature. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to empower the micro decisions of those smaller priority calls to happen by the feature lead. And this is really all about getting a bit of a product manager on everyone, helping everyone being able to make priority calls, but also to helping scale product management in the organization. So in terms of your reference to managing the project scope, yeah, we're certainly still involved in that. So a lot of the discussions that we will have in our feature lead is, yep, let's definitely make that one out of scope. Or this story, no, we really think there's we have. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question, Amy. And I think Mark had another question about your point earlier, John, about the best approaches to structure Jira with projects and teams.
Yeah, so Mark asked whether it's possible to switch between different approaches inside of Jira or whether you have to start again. The answer is yes, you can switch. So you can change the way you're using Jira. You can change the workflow that you're using. You can change anything basically, and remap all the existing tickets that you've got to suit your new workflow or your new statuses or whatever you change. So that's easy to do. I think the key thing too, just with the Jira thing, like it's pretty much how the key thing I think is your definition of done. For us, at the end of the day, we want everybody to have the same definition of done, so we can understand where something's at. In the distance past, we had an issue where that was not necessarily the case. Some people were using closed, some were using resolved, some were using done, and they meant different things. It meant it was finished or it was actually in the product. So I think at the end of the day, whatever approach you use, the key thing is that everybody has that same definition of done. The other thing Mark mentioned too was the excellent beer advice. So yes, thanks, Mark. Glad that you appreciated that.
Yeah, good to see you got something super valuable out of the webinar, and it's good that you won't even be trying John's beer because you can't even get that anywhere else in the world except for New Zealand. So go with the 4 pints, Mark. I highly recommend that one. Amy, we'll finish off with the last question here from Amy, and she talked about. I guess this idea of a work breakdown structure, and she said, do you feel that you can get a higher project success by having a work breakdown structure for each project and then creating your backlog from that? You can get all input from stakeholders and avoid the upfront misses. Amy, certainly there are many teams that love having a WBS or a work breakdown structure for their projects. And again, I would say if it works for you and it gives you predictable, high-quality features that are providing high value, I wouldn't change it at all. For us, we've tried a similar structure internally where we did kind of have a bit of a WBS for a particular project. The challenge is we fell into the pitfall, and again, this is just for us, we fell into a pitfall where it felt like we have to follow the work breakdown structure to complete a project. So it became a little bit waterfally for us. But I don't think that's too much of a problem if you have someone that's kind of aware and constantly watching, hey guys, you don't actually have to literally check off these 50